is Mark Gunn Media.
Hit it!
Welcome to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. I'm your host, Mark Gunn. The views expressed on this program are those of the host and guests and not necessarily reflective of anyone or any entity associated with this broadcast. This episode brought to you by Before Your First Gig, an audiobook written by Steve Dustcircle and produced by Mark Gunn Media. If you're a beginning musician, this is a primer that you'll definitely want to hear. Tips and strategies for setting yourself up for live performances and paid gigs. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Available now on iTunes, Audible.com, and Amazon. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Produced by Mark Gunn Media. This episode, Rethink Your Drink, Reevaluating Our Relationship with the Democratic Party.
It's a time for us to reevaluate our relationship, I'm talking about black people, with the Democratic Party.
I think that we need to evaluate it, but I think we need to do it in historical context. One, blacks became Democratic because Democratic Party started dealing with their issues. I was born in the 50s. My parents, my pastor, were Republicans. Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Republican governor of New York, used to come to our church. Jackie Robinson, the first black to play baseball, was a Republican, brought him to our church. Blacks started registering as Democrats when Nixon ran against Kennedy, and Nixon would not stand up for Martin Luther King in jail. Kennedy did, and we started gradually going that way. By 1964, after Kennedy had been killed, and Johnson championed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, that's when we went all Democrat. So if the reason we left Republican and went Democrat is because our interest was being addressed, then that's the reason we evaluate now, are you still addressing it? The only reason I think you haven't seen a mass exodus is the Republicans have been hostile to blacks.
So is there a third party opportunity?
I think that it has to be done by people that will be able to address the issues and get the funding. Because now politics is such about who can raise the money.
Insanity. The act of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. As a registered independent, I maintain that black Democrats and Republicans are insane. I'll explain, but first a history lesson. You know how you keep hearing that most blacks vote Democrat, right? Well, that wasn't always the case. At one point in history, blacks were decidedly Republican.
In July 1964, GOP delegates streamed into San Francisco from all over the country. They met in the Cow Palace, a converted livestock pavilion. It was less than a month after civil rights workers Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner had been kidnapped on a Mississippi back road during Freedom Summer. Then, 2 weeks before the convention, Lyndon Johnson made this announcement.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Tufts University historian Peniel Joseph says the national events leading up to the 64 GOP convention affected what went on there.
One of the legacies of Freedom Summer is connected to the politics and the transformation of the Republican National Party. Absolutely.
Vincent Hutchings, a political science professor at the University of Michigan, studies voter patterns and says while they seem like a rarity now, black Republicans weren't always an oxymoron.
The data suggests that even as late as 1960, only about 2/3 of African Americans were identified with the Democratic Party. Now, 2/3 is a pretty big number, but when you compare it to today, that number hovers in the neighborhood of 90%.
Hutchings says after the Civil War, most black voters were Republicans. The party of Lincoln had, after all, emancipated them and given them the vote during Reconstruction, something deeply resented by white Southerners who were mostly Democrats then. Hutchings says the black exodus from the Republican Party began in the 1930s, during Franklin Roosevelt's second term.
African Americans were attracted to the Democratic Party for the same reasons that many other Americans were, because of the New Deal, because of the economic crisis, and the efforts on the part of the Roosevelt administration to address the staggering poverty of the time.
In 1964, black Republicans assumed they would back New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was socially liberal and fiscally moderate. But Rockefeller's messy divorce upset delegates we'd now label family values voters, and his moderate supporters were blindsided by the well-organized supporters of the unapologetically conservative senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. In his now famous acceptance speech, Goldwater promised to vigorously pursue states' rights and freedom from big government.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
It's a very specific notion of liberty. Small government, a government that doesn't give out handouts to black people, a government that doesn't have laws that interferes with states' rights, a government that is not conducting a war on poverty.
That's Peniel Joseph. He believes Goldwater's speech was a welcome signal to many disgruntled white Southern voters, and, says Vince Hutchings, a disturbing message to black ones.
African Americans heard the message that was intended to be heard, which is that Goldwater and the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party was opposed not just to the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, but to the civil rights movement in large part as well.
Hutchings says the months after that speech saw not a trickle of blacks leaving the GOP, but a flood.
It was an abrupt shift for those relatively few, but still not trivial fraction of blacks. The writing on the wall was clear for these voters, and they moved aggressively, almost unanimously, into the Democratic Party.
At a Los Angeles farmer's market, virtually every black person I approached told me he or she was a registered Democrat, including this man.
Arthur Little, and I am affiliated with the Democratic Party, of course.
And why?
Because I think of it as the party that is at least officially interested in putting people's rights before corporate rights.
As she offers passersby handmade soap, Jasmine Patton Gant says her family has been Democrats for decades, and she's voted in almost every election since she could vote.
I'm a Democrat only because I've inherited that from my parents. It's not as though I would be a Republican, but I'm completely dissatisfied with both parties.
So the Republican choice of Barry Goldwater in 1964 drove black voters into the Democrats' arms, where 90% of them remain. But if Jasmine Patton Gant is any indication, at least some might be willing to be wooed by a more ardent suitor.
So as we migrated to the party, we began to see an increase in political influence. More of us becoming elected officials and moderate gains being made. Slowly but surely, the black vote became more and more important, and we were being called the, quote, backbone of the Democratic Party.
Black voters increasingly becoming a major part of Democratic primary politics, growing from less than 10% of Democratic primary voters back in 1976 to at least 1 out of 4 we are expecting.
However, over time, a disturbing pattern was emerging. The black vote was being taken for granted.
For too long, I think candidates have taken for granted constituencies that have been the backbone of the Democratic Party. You know, they show up when it's close to election time and show up in a black church and want to get the vote, but just haven't been there before. I mean, there are plenty of people who applauded black women for the success of the 2018 election, applauded black women for the election of a senator from Alabama, but at some point, folks get tired of just saying, oh, thank me for showing up, and say, well, show up for me. Because when black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with childbirth in America, when the sons of black women will die because of gun violence more than any other cause of death, when black women make 61 cents on the dollar as compared to all women who tragically make 80 cents on the dollar, the question has to be, where you been? And what are you going to do?
The only time you saw your representative in a lot of cases was when it was time to get out the vote.
When I've traveled and met primarily with African American audiences around the country, there's an eagerness for somebody to meet with them. The Democrats have completely taken this whole body of vote for granted. It's just Democrat, but then you get there, like when I was in Ferguson, I wanted to ask them about the unhappiness, and they said they hadn't seen their Democrat congressman in 6 years. Because it's an entirely African-American district, African-American congressman, and he didn't bother to come because he didn't need to.
And when you did see them, the pandering was so blatant that it was offensive.
See, I believe that Democrats have a special obligation. If we're going to ask African-Americans to vote for us, we cannot take you or your vote for granted. We can't just show up at election time and say the right things and think that's enough. We can't start building relationships a few weeks before a vote. We have to demonstrate a sustained commitment to building opportunity, creating prosperity, and righting wrongs, not just every 2 or 4 years, not just when the cameras are on and people are watching, but every single day.
This from a woman who talked about having hot sauce in her purse on a syndicated morning show and had the gall to show up in a black church here in Louisville in order to stage a photo op with the preachers and clergy there. Because of this and other tactics by the Republican Party, which we'll get into shortly, there's been a steady increase in voter apathy within the black community, and our not voting has been proven to be detrimental to Democrats. Another problem with the Democrats is the overall focus on black women, while ignoring the black male vote.
I think we are making a mistake when we keep saying that the base of the Democratic Party is black women. The reality is, if you look at the numbers, black women voted the highest for Hillary Clinton. The second highest group that voted for Hillary Clinton was black men. And I think it's a mistake for candidates to ignore black men. I've talked to people, and I say it, y'all need to have a black men only town hall. I said, go to one of these cities, because here's the deal. There was a 9-point gap between black men who voted for Obama and Romney. It was a 9-point gap between the percentage of black women who voted for Obama versus Romney and black men. 9 points less for black men in 2012. In 2016, it was a wider gap than that. Something is happening here where black men are not seeing these issues the same way as black women. I just think that, again, the mistake is that black men are still voting overwhelmingly Democrat, and it's wrong to leave them out of these conversations. Common sense says if there was a 9-point gap between black men and black women for Obama and Romney, and there was a larger gap between black men and black women when it came to Hillary and Trump, y'all got a black male problem. If you're a Democrat, you can't afford for 82% of black men supporting a Democratic candidate. You need that number to be like black women, 90, 92, 94%. When you keep hearing it over and over and over again, black women, black women, black women, there's a gap on this side, and you might want to pay attention to it, because you can go hard for black women and get that number to be 94, 95, 96, but if the black male number is 86, 84, 82, 80, that actually cancels out the increase of black women.
Over the last several years, you're seeing more and more black people leaving the Democrats, like I did several years ago. Whether it be just an overall dissatisfaction of the candidates being put forth, or behind-the-scenes machinations and dirty dealings, leaving you unsatisfied with the party.
I wanted to return back to this issue of black voters. I have a lifetime of experience with black voters. I've been one since I was 18. Black voters are pissed off, and they're worried. They're pissed off because the only time our issues seem to be really paid attention to by politicians is when people are looking for their vote. And they're worried because the Democratic Party, we don't want to see people miss this opportunity and lose because we are nominating someone that isn't trusted, doesn't have authentic connection. And so that's what's on the ballot, and issues do matter.
We've been telling Democrats that they haven't lived up to their end of the bargain with us, and it gave you a black voter turnout of 59.6%, down from the 66.6% we saw in 2012. It also gave you Donald Trump, whose only appeal to black voters was,
what do you have to lose? You're living in poverty. Your schools are no good. You have no jobs. 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose?
Here we are in 2020, and the black exodus from the Democrats continues. I'm sure you've noticed how a once widely diverse presidential field has slowly dwindled down into only white candidates. Andrew Yang, the last person of color, suspended his campaign just this week. Speaking of people of color, one of the other knocks against the Democratic Party was their severe lack of people of color in leadership and consultant positions. Some of the candidates who have now gone by the wayside seem to have learned from that mistake. Be that as it may, the Democrats are realizing that getting the black vote isn't going to be as easy as it used to be. They can no longer use Donald Trump as the boogeyman.
Tell me a little bit about who you're thinking you like for the 2020 election.
I like Biden because I think he'll still have a lot of what Obama did. I'm hoping Elizabeth Warren actually succeed in her bid for the nomination, I think we got a great team, but I think Biden and Bernie are low past a lifespan,
Hester and her daughter Stephanie represent a generational divide that is showing up in polls. Like most older black voters, Hester is strongly in the Joe Biden camp. She likes his connection to former President Barack Obama. Stephanie likes Biden, but she also likes Sanders, and her mind isn't quite made up yet.
There are times when African Americans are given this message of criminal justice. I'm going to come to your church and talk about all these other things. Is there pandering that you worry about?
Absolutely. Yes, most definitely. Yeah. We don't need a candidate to play on our emotions. We just want someone to get the job done.
As African American women, what are your concerns when you think about your race and your gender?
I'm concerned about equity now in the job market and housing, and to make sure that our children are not straddled with debt. The candidates need to sit down and say, look, let's work together collectively. Let's work together as a united front.
The other problem Democrats have is their lack of engagement with young black voters.
These young African Americans intend to vote, but for now, there's not a lot of excitement.
I feel as though each candidate is just trying to beat the current president. They're not really trying to push off or present anything that's really attention-getting.
I would have to say that I'm not as enthused as I was about the previous two elections where Obama was actually in the running as a presidential candidate.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has around 35% support among South Carolina Democrats, a 20-point advantage over his closest competitor, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. Analysts say Biden's connection to Barack Obama, America's first black president, is an asset in a state with a large African American community. But these South Carolina State University students say they have not yet picked a favorite in the Democratic field.
I really haven't been wowed by any candidates. It's a few that I like, or they have some good points, but it's not like, oh my gosh, I need them right now. So I want to make the best decision.
In the Democratic field, African American candidates have struggled. Political science professor Willie Black says black Democrats have one overriding goal.
African American voters, in total, their overwhelming issue that they all cling to is to find someone that could beat Donald Trump.
But that may not be enough to inspire younger voters, who Black says the candidates have yet to engage.
They're not putting forth plans that will really grab the voters' attention and make a large segment of them, the voters, the African American electorate, to want to come to them.
While change is a universal demand among Democratic voters, young people tend to be drawn to the candidates with the boldest ideas on health care and economic opportunity.
Healthcare is, of course, a big must-have in my book, as well as student loan forgiveness, because I do want to go to medical school as well.
Many young African Americans may be undecided now, but know their votes could be pivotal in the upcoming primary election.
As of this recording, the New Hampshire primary ended with Senator Bernie Sanders getting 26% of the vote. South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg was second with 24%, and Minnesota Congresswoman Amy Klobuchar was third. While former Vice President Joe Biden continues to enjoy the largest support among black voters, Sanders has the second best number. Buttigieg and Klobuchar have a serious problem in reaching us, both due to issues of race and the police. Here's a question for you. If more of us are leaving the Democrats, where are we going to go? I'll tell you after this. If you're an advertiser, one of the most important things about getting your message out is actually standing out from the rest of the crowd. If you're listening to this program right now, this is where you'd hear your commercial. As an exclusive sponsor of Gunshots Straight from the Hip, your commercial is professionally produced and gets a longer shelf life based on your needs. Gunshots Straight from the Hip is a unique and compelling program unlike anything else in the marketplace. Episodes are available for download on iTunes, TuneIn, and MarkGunMedia.com. And depending on how you tailor your message, the potential for new and repeat customers is that much greater. Best of all, it's extremely cost-effective. If you'd like more information on how you can be a sponsor of this broadcast, call Mark Gun Media Inc. at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Or log on to markgunmedia.com. For downloads of this and past episodes and information about all the multimedia services we offer, log on to our website at www.markgunmedia.com. That's markgunmedia.com. Welcome back to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. I'm Mark Gunn, and we've been talking about the need for black people to reevaluate our relationship with the Democratic Party. How did we get here in the first place?
You actually probably have to go back over a century to begin telling the story, right? African Americans start out when they become essentially enfranchised. They do so because of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and therefore African Americans sort of by default become Republicans because that is the party of emancipation. The Republican Party, while it's in favor of emancipation, is not really a natural place to put African Americans, especially as the Republican Party goes through the late 1800s and early 1900s and goes through some sort of realignments inside itself and turns away from a possible progressive move with Theodore Roosevelt and becomes increasingly in the early 20th century more the party of white-collar business interest, upper-class interest. But now you get African Americans moving into the North where they can vote, and they begin to find the appeal of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal very attractive. They begin increasingly to identify with the Democratic Party. Doesn't happen overnight, right? Partisan attachments take a while to erode during the late 30s and early 40s and late 40s to turn from a party that had been held hostage to states' rights in the South to one that was willing to embrace civil rights. You see that in the behavior of Harry S. Truman, right, who's going to integrate the armed services by executive order after World War II. You see that in the 1948 Democratic Convention. Then Senator Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota gets up and says, it's time for us to walk out of the shadow of states' rights into the bright sunshine of civil rights. At the same time, the Republican Party is struggling with its history of emancipation and civil rights. You get someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who says that integration, desegregation should go slow. That sort of personifies some of this movement of the Republican Party away from its traditional belief in civil rights and extending rights to African Americans. Especially by the mid-1960s, you get Lyndon Johnson, who's going to take the lead on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and by that point, the ship is cooked, right? The Republican Party opposes it. Its standard bearer, Barry Goldwater, opposes it in 1964. He calls it a piece of communistic legislation. At that point, I think the door closes, right? At that point, African Americans who are politically active are Democrats.
I asked before the break that if more blacks are leaving the Democrats, where are they going? Well, it sure as hell isn't back to the GOP. There are several reasons why the party of Lincoln, the party of conservatism and fiscal responsibility, no longer appeal to the 98% of black voters. All of them can be boiled down to one word: racism.
I just have a problem with revisionist history. I have a problem with the fact that we continue to make it seem like racism all of a sudden was discovered, right, with Donald Trump. That's not really the case. I remember when Michael Steele was damn near ostracized and kicked out of the RNC. I remember when the Barack the Magic Negro ad came out. I remember when birtherism was a thing. I remember when there was racism tied to the war on drugs with Ronald Reagan. I remember all of these things and what has happened over time, not just in the Republican Party, because the Democrats have blood on their hands too. It's just not equal. Is we have allowed covert racism to surface, and now it's overt. That is all that's happened, because for years we pretended like covert racism wasn't really that thing. We pretended like it wasn't the undercover N-word. We pretended like calling people ghetto and hood rats wasn't racism, and all of the time it was. And now that thing has become volatile and angry and violent. That is the problem. We cannot continue to say that racism just surfaced. It's been here. This country was built on that. We cannot turn our minds we can't do that.
Under Trump, we have moved from silence to permission. I hate these conversations because it forces Republicans to confront a reality that I believe, which is this president is racist. This is why traditional Republicans struggle with his leadership. We can't forgive it. We can't normalize it. We can't suggest that he can be the figure of a party that we subscribe to. It's heartbreaking. It's not an easy conversation. It sucks.
I'm told every day I'm on air that I'm racist because I call out racism. That is maddening to me, and I'm crying about it because it's crazy. That is so frustrating. We're supposed to be talking about a 12-year-old boy who was just trying to deliver newspapers and the police are called on him in Ohio where Tamir Rice was killed and the same age. I want to be acknowledged and seen that this is not okay for our children. This is not okay for the future direction of this country. So I want to say, I commend you for saying what you said. It means the world to me.
There has always been an effort to suppress the black vote by both parties.
This country has made a promise to its citizens that when they step into the ballot box, they will be free from racial discrimination. And it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that our democracy reflects all of us. Race and voting have been intertwined since the founding of our country. There was a point in time where you couldn't vote unless you were of a certain race. After the Civil War, with the adoptions of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, we formally expanded the franchise to black males, but then we saw states come in and pass restrictive laws like literacy tests and grandfather clauses that went and undid a number of those gains. And that sort of expansion and then backlash is something that we see throughout our nation's history. After we elected our country's first African-American president, we saw a number of states pass restrictive legislation across the country that would have made it harder for minorities to be able to register and to vote. Even now, we still see a number of policies on the book that are legacies of some of the most dark and shameful parts of our country's history. For example, felony disenfranchisement laws, which have in many instances a root in a Jim Crow past, and they're still disproportionately affecting African Americans and minorities. We have seen numerous efforts of politicians trying to pass certain laws to discourage people who might not be supportive of them or their agenda from getting passed. For example, the strict photo identification law in Texas was passed after we saw a very big demographic shift and an inclusion of more Latino voters being introduced into the electorate. We can see this in political gerrymandering, where politicians are trying to carve up election districts so that they're able to maintain their position of power. It silences the beauty of the many voices that we have in this democracy, and it is something that we as a country have struggled with for a very long time.
However, it was decided that in the 60s, the Republican Party would weaponize racism as a means to an end.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Despite every bit of evidence that shows that the Republican Party remains hostile to black voters, there is an average of around 10% of black folks who support GOP candidates and identify as Republicans.
Do you think that the Republican Party has a racism problem?
Yes, they do. And I think we need to be honest and acknowledge it. And I think that, you know, the fact that people sit here and now and say, you know, that, well, this has nothing to do with race. Yeah, it does. Yeah. And that's fine. Let's acknowledge that. I'm not saying you are racist. I'm saying you're having a problem with talking about and making expressions around race that oftentimes come off not just insensitive, but downright racist. And so what we want is clarity on this subject. We want a clear voice, and we want the party leadership to stand up in the face of behavior and words and actions that indicate to the American people that we support the kind of ugly, racist comments that we've heard in the past by many that are not true, starting with things like S-hole and from there. So there's a whole lot on the table that we have to deal with and be honest about. And I just want leadership in this party to be honest. Don't be afraid of it. Walk into it and tell us how you're going to lead on it.
Part of the issue with the GOP is the willful ignorance of quite a few of its members.
I don't think there was any racism until Obama got elected. That we never had problems like this. You know, I'm in the real estate industry. There's none. Now, you know, with the people with the guns and shooting up neighborhoods and not being responsible citizens, that's a big change. And I think that's the philosophy that Obama has perpetuated on America. And if you're black and you haven't been successful in the last 50 years, it's your own fault. I think that when we look at the last 50 years, where are we and why? We have 3 generations of all still having unwed babies, kids that don't go through high school. I mean, when do they take responsibility for how they live? I think it's due time, and I think that's good that Mr. Trump is pointing that out.
It's that very racism that continues to fuel ongoing voter suppression efforts.
Voters in some of this year's presidential primaries may be in for a rude awakening. More than a dozen states have passed laws since the last presidential election that require voters to show government-issued photo ID at the polls, which could keep millions from casting a ballot.
11% of eligible Americans don't have these categories of state-issued photo IDs. When you're looking at particular demographics, the percentage is even higher.
Indiana was the first state to pass such a law, and Republicans in other states followed suit, but most of their attempts were blocked by judges or Democratic legislators and governors. Then, in 2010, the Republicans won big at both the national and the state level. They picked up 11 governorships and gained control of 57 state legislative chambers, where they quickly got to work passing strict voter ID laws. These states got a boost from the Supreme Court when it rolled back parts of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Now, states with a history of discrimination wouldn't have to worry about the courts stepping in and calling their voter ID laws unconstitutional. The majority of these voter ID bills were approved on party line votes. Democrats opposed them, and Republicans argued that voter ID laws helped prevent voter fraud. But a Justice Department investigation under George W. Bush only prosecuted 86 cases of voter fraud in 5 years.
It really just doesn't happen. Americans are more likely to get struck by lightning than they are to encounter somebody who's committed the kind of voter fraud that gets stopped by voter ID laws.
When voter fraud does happen, it's much more likely to involve the use of absentee ballots, from people using fake names to vote, to groups that go to nursing homes and pressure residents to sign absentee ballots for a certain candidate. But absentee ballots are more likely to favor Republicans, and these strict voter ID bills, they don't deal with them. It doesn't exactly help the GOP cause when its members admit that these laws are about keeping people from voting.
The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
And there's research to back up the idea that this is a political strategy for Republicans. 2 political scientists found that states with increased minority voter turnout between 2004 and 2008 were more likely to pass restrictive voter ID laws than other states. And voters in a lot of these places, they can't help but be reminded of another time when opponents sought to limit their right to vote. The tools may have changed, but the goal sounds all too familiar.
With the election of Donald Trump as president, the Republican Party's racism is on full display.
We have an opportunity today to condemn or condone. Birtherism is racist. Saying a Mexican judge can't be fair because of his heritage is racist. Saying immigrants from Mexico are rapists is racist. Saying there were good people on both sides in Charlottesville is racist. Calling African countries shithole countries is racist. And telling 4 members of this body to go home is racist.
And yet you have other members of his party bending over backwards to either defend it or say nothing altogether.
Take a step back on matters of race. Too often, people on the left too quickly accuse people on the right of being racist, and too often people on the right don't quickly disavow it. And so this has been going on for decades.
There's been no Republican president who has been as overt on race
since Herbert Hoover, who led the Lily White movement when he was president. That's what you're dealing with here. This is a president who knows this game and who is playing it. It is a dangerous game. When you have Republican Will Hurd of Texas, the only black Republican in the House, vote with Democrats. When you have a former top judge in Texas, a Latina, who says his ideology is racism, you cannot ignore this reality. What's even more shameful, not only to see Republicans being afraid, to see white conservative evangelicals say nothing. Franklin Graham, silent. Pastor Paula White, silent. Robert Jeffers defends it. When you see Ralph Reed, silent. Tony Perkins, silent. If you read Frederick Douglass's speech, what does the 4th of July mean to the slave? His most condemnation was for white Christians. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail for white Christians. Evangelicals who are white and conservative need to challenge this president and say, what you're doing is wrong, shameful, and despicable, and you should stop. But he won't, because he is leading policies and also appealing to white fear.
With few exceptions, you have an entire party that once touted itself as being the party of emancipation and freeing the slaves, living in total denial of its racial problems.
I think this is life or death for the Republican Party, and I don't. That's not an overstatement. The party has to stand for something, and they elected somebody who couldn't exert moral leadership, and that's what presidents are supposed to do. They're supposed to exert moral leadership so that people understand where the country stands. And when he cannot provide moral leadership, then the party has to decide what they're going to be. And the stain of racism is now splattering all across the party.
But you knew exactly what you were buying when you went into the store and you supported Donald Trump. You knew what you were getting. These signals were there during the campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. But now we can take corrective action. It's a little late, but the party needs to hold Donald Trump accountable.
And so far, it hasn't, and frankly, it won't. I remember a few years ago when the GOP was slaughtered in the midterm elections. They talked about having an autopsy in which they supposedly did some self-reflection as to why they got their asses handed to them. The overriding issue was their lack of appeal and hostile relationship with people of color. There was all this talk about coming up with effective minority outreach programs and being more inclusive as a party. What you have in 2020 is a party whose brand name is Donald Trump. And that brand is extremely toxic.
Be on the lookout for a new Washington Post Ipsos poll that shows 90% of black Americans disapproving of Trump's job performance, 83% believing he's racist. Now, Trump thinks the economy will boost him with those voters, but blaming both sides for violence in Charlottesville and so much other ugly talk matters. Some things matter more than money.
But what happened to all of these polls that they're pointing out saying, well, the president's numbers among African Americans, they're growing. He's 35%. We know better than that.
But the idea that nobody's been better for the blacks than I have.
Oh, please. If you're the president of the United States, you should have people educate you. You should want to be educated. You shouldn't be calling people the blacks. You shouldn't be yelling out, where's my African American? What else do you have to lose? By the way, that phrase, if you look into the poll and you read the Washington Post story, it turned off so many African Americans. And in that poll, African Americans say, this economy that he touts so much and says that he's responsible for, they don't believe he's responsible for it. They do give credit to the former president, Barack Obama, for the economy. And they say pretty much they give credit more than anything to themselves for the economic responsibility.
Working hard,
for
picking up savings,
Yes,
finding different avenues. No question about it. Personal industry is the best industry in America. You say people of color should go back where they come from. You know what he called countries that have predominantly brown-skinned people in them. You know where he talked about immigrants.
So, listen, as a person of color who has this particular platform, you remember when I said the president of the United States was racist? I opened up this show by saying that. I got a whole lot of guff. But you know what? 90% of African Americans believe that and feel that in this country. And I speak for those people, especially with the rhetoric coming out of the president's mouth.
Now you can see why the GOP is not for me, nor should it be for any other black person. So if we should leave the Democrats because they continue to pimp us for our vote and ignore us after they get it, and the Republicans continue to prove its racist hostility toward us, where do we go and what do we do? I'll tell you after this. If you're an advertiser, one of the most important things about getting your message out is actually standing out from the rest of the crowd. If you're listening to this program right now, this is where you'd hear your commercial. As an exclusive sponsor of Gunshots Straight from the Hip, your commercial is professionally produced and gets a longer shelf life based on your needs. Gunshots Straight from the Hip is a unique and compelling program unlike anything else in the marketplace. Episodes are available for download on iTunes, TuneIn, and MarkGunMedia.com. And depending on how you tailor your message, the potential for new and repeat customers is that much greater. Best of all, it's extremely cost-effective. If you'd like more information on how you can be a sponsor of this broadcast, call Mark Gun Media Inc. at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Or log on to markgunmedia.com. For downloads of this and past episodes and information about all the multimedia services we offer, log on to our website at www.markgunmedia.com. That's markgunmedia.com. Welcome back to Gunshots Straight from the Hip.
What I'm supposed to do, blame Trump? He ain't never really gave a Ain't nobody raised minimum wage. None of these jobs pay enough. I think they just want to keep us broke, cause they ain't putting none in place for us. This how all my people feel, but we gotta learn. We complained enough, let me change it up. Everything I just said, everybody I know think the same way. See, they don't want to see us vote, and we never do, so we see the same thing. But all our votes really do count, and they'll never really let it show. So now I'm finna break it down, cause if I don't, you would probably never know.
The song you're hearing is called My Vote Don't Count by Yellow Pain. This young brother's taking us through a civics lesson that we probably forgot in school about all three branches of government and how voting affects each one. For my money, it's going to be one of the most must-see videos of 2020. Check it out on YouTube when you get a chance, okay? Now, we've been talking about the need for Black Americans to reevaluate our relationship with the Democratic Party. I know for some of you that bringing this up right now could be seen as the wrong thing to do because getting rid of Donald Trump and the Republicans is the most important thing. But here's the bottom line. You can't do it without us. Any less than 93 to 95% of black voter turnout in November means that Trump gets 4 more years. And without us, you don't stand a chance in hell of taking the Senate either. A smart person would realize that the current relationship isn't working. Black people are tired of being the abused spouse that keeps hearing, "I'm sorry, baby, I'm gonna do better, I promise," only to end up doing the same song and dance over and over again. For black voters, getting rid of Donald John Trump and his racist bootlickers in the Senate is our most important priority. So much so that in recent polling, Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York and head cheerleader of its infamous Stop and Frisk program, the same Mike Bloomberg who went on record as saying that he sent cops into black neighborhoods because, quote, they commit the most crime. That very Mike Bloomberg, who has the most horrible record on race among any Democratic candidate, now has 27% of the black vote, beating Bernie Sanders and just a few points behind Joe Biden. Given all that, here's what you have to realize about black people as a whole. At the end of the day, Trump getting reelected ultimately means very little to us because we've been dealing with America's racism for 400 years. What's 4 more?
You're black, you're poor, you're ugly, you're nothing at all.
Now, that doesn't let us as black people off the hook either. When I said that we needed to leave the party, I meant it. Since the GOP isn't an option, we need to form a third voting bloc as independents with no loyalty to either party. As far as I'm concerned, neither party has earned it. This only works if we're monolithic in our thinking and voting. Democrats fear this kind of move because they know they can't win without us. Republicans are too stupid to be afraid because they think it and their ongoing voter suppression efforts will stop us from voting altogether. Let this serve as notice to both parties. It's like Miss Seeley said in the movie, The Color Purple.
You do right by me. Everything you even think about gonna fail.
I've already left Black America. You coming with me? You've been listening to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. The views expressed are those of the host and guests and not reflective of any business entity or anyone associated with this broadcast. If you have any comments or want more information on how to be a sponsor, log on to our website at markgunmedia.com or call us at 502 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Thank you for listening.
Mark Gun Media. No hype, no hoopla, just damn good work.